Sitting on this side of me is Stephen Hellman, who is the anchor of, or has been the anchor of the comparative politics program in our department. He and Leo were the masterminds behind this really impressive comparative politics course. I see some nodding heads of the grad students who have felt that they were very well prepared to go out into the world after having taken this course, particularly with Steve. Steve is a scholar of the Communist Party in Italy, looking at the intersection of elections and social movements. So I know he's going to have some interesting contributions. Steve.
Okay. I need a microphone. Happily, sitting next to Avishai and with Sam Ginton in the room, I don't have to get into the who met Leo first poker game because I'd be put in the dust. Although I actually think that the first time we met personally, as opposed to through correspondence, was when Leo came to the University of Toronto to Rhiannon Mahone's dissertation defense. Am I right? Yeah. I was in the room. I was downtown at U of T for some other reason. We're collaborating on something with a colleague down there, and somebody mentioned my name, and suddenly from down below there was this person on the floor lying out, looking at things on the floor, and the deep rumbling voice of Leo said, "Are you Steve Hellman?" And I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "You translated this book?" And it's a really obscure sort of title, but Leo not only knew I had been the translator of it, which is something you'd have to get on the inside pages to read. It wasn't like splattered all over the top, but he had actually read the book. And his comment to me was, "Mazel tov." So that was, how could anyone ever forget an initial thing like that and not have a very warm spot in his heart for Leo from the very, very beginning. And the only other thing I would add, because no one else has mentioned it, although a lot of people have mentioned the table at the Panich household, on top of everything else, Leo's really a very good cook too. People should know that. His latkes, his ossobuco, his braised lamb shank. I mean, we're talking serious dishes here that the guy's very good. So just in case there are some areas about Leo the person you didn't know, I thought I'd elaborate on that. But actually, the purpose, the thing I want to talk about here is what Gramsci might call a molecular view of Leo's contribution to the Department of Political Science. And when I mentioned briefly to Leo that I was going to talk about this, he got all squirmy and embarrassed and said, why don't you talk about Gramsci and education or something like that? But I said, no, this actually fits in terms of education for democracy. What I want to talk about is, it's been alluded to already, Judy in particular mentioned it, but some other people, John Peters mentioned earlier about the things about our lectures. There, the annual political science lecture in political science, that was something else. So I'll get to those things pretty quickly, but I wanted to start with something that might in fact be news to a lot of people here who aren't as grizzled veterans of York University as a few of us are here, and I see just a few familiar faces. And that is that if you want to understand Leo's legacy to the Department of Political Science, the first place to start is just step off the elevator in the south wing of the Ross building and look around you. And what you see is not what you would have seen before Leo became chair, because like many other floors of the Ross building, especially the really dreary prison-like, penitentiary-like south wing, now there's a very different kind of layout, and that also is something that has something to do with what happened when Leo was chair. Similarly, if you walk around and you poke around in the right corners, the committee room, which has the rather mysterious Kabbalistic number S666. But in that committee room, there are a whole bunch of old posters of old departmental seminars we used to hold in the department on a fairly regular basis. And they're like these Jorge Luis Borgesian, if you've ever read the story he writes about the map maker, who wrote a map, who tried to design, people tried to design maps, and they ended up with just fragments of these maps hanging from trees and cactuses in the middle of the desert, etc. Well, these things aren't quite that elaborate or that arcane, but you'll see a whole series of posters talking about that year's or that semester's scheduled speakers and who was going to speak and the topics that we're going to speak on. And that is also a kind of archaeological artifact of Leo's tenure as chair, which goes back quite a few years already, right? Early 90s you finished? Yeah, so we're talking way back when, okay? So having set that up, leaving you on the edge of your chairs to find, well, what about these seminars, what about this? Let me start at more or less at the beginning. And that is that when Leo arrived at York in 1984, and I should add in parentheses, he arrived in our department. We got not just Leo, but Reg Whitaker as well, which was quite a coup for us, and I'm sure something our colleagues at Carleton never forgave us for. But you have to believe me, it wasn't a raid. You know, we advertised for a senior position, and we got 2 senior applicants, and we managed to persuade the dean and the powers that be that both of them were absolutely unavoidable. Well, in any case, we got them. And when we got them, of course, it enormously enhanced what I should emphasize was our already quite prominent profile as a very progressive department, and not just a bunch of Marxists, but progressive across the board, noted above all for critical approaches in a number of disciplines, so much so that some of our critical colleagues were at war with one another. I would briefly refer to the polarization in the international relations field. This wasn't about the lefties versus the righties. This was one brand of leftism versus another brand of leftism. So we already had that very strong profile, but clearly what happened was Leo comes in, and knowing Leo, he immediately is struck by how little communication is taking place intra-departmentally among all these people with a very similar kind of profile, and certainly with a whole lot more in common than they had that separated them. Yet there was not very much going on, nor was there just about anything at all going on in terms of projecting our profile outward into the broader world. And I guess, if this was a different kind of gathering, we could speculate about how is it that the department became the way it was, that there was, on the one hand, very progressive content, but on the other hand, very laissez-faire style. Just everybody just sort of off cultivating their own garden, doing their own thing. But as I say, the point here isn't to do an analysis of the then Department of Political Science, since this year now renamed the Department of Politics. How did it become that way? We'll have to leave that to the historians. And also, while I see Lisa North is also here, there are a couple of us whose appointment date to the very, very early 1970s. In order really to go back, you'd have to go back to the 60s when the department was first created and the way it evolved the first 7-8 years to get better answers to those questions. So I'll just leave that on the side because I'm not sure I could answer it very well anyway. But there it is. The point is, Leo came, he looked at the department, he looked at what was going on, and he said, this is no good. And basically, because he made no bones about thinking it was no good, he was rewarded by being elected chair. And that, of course, is what happens when you open your mouth in an organization, right? And not only that, but he then served 2 terms as chair because he had an agenda that he actually wanted to institute. And again, here again, it says something about Leo, and that is that at York, because of the eyedropper nature with which the senior administration and even the intermediate administration gives you any benefits at all, most of the time, almost all the time, when people are appointed to relatively important administrative positions, historically this was the case anyway, what they would do is then negotiate ferociously with the various deans in order to get some benefits for themselves. Because let's face it, it's a pretty thankless kind of job, and you get a joke of an honorarium, and you got a little bit of teaching release. And for the rest of it, you know, you were gonna suffer. Leo's terms of negotiation were not for what goodies he was going to get, but he insisted that if he was going to be chair, and there was a very strong surge in favor of his being chair, he had to get a commitment that certain things were going to change, and that the university, the faculty in particular, was going to spend money in order to institute those changes. And that was the deal that Leo did for himself. And again, I think it just says something about the kind of orientation in practice that he had in terms of educating the department and, as far as he could, the institution for democracy. Okay, so very briefly then, having established all that, let me just enumerate a few of the things that happened under Leo and why you see a department that looks very different than it did before. One thing, and I can say this as somebody who was involved, there were all sorts of different sized offices that faculty occupied. And, you know, get a faculty member and pry him or her loose from the office that he or she occupies, and, you know, you need a crowbar. Well, what Leo, by, again, force of personality and logical suasion did was persuade us all to give up our 3 window offices and trade them down for a restructuring of the entire wing into 2 window offices. Why? So that we could bring more members of the department together on the same floor where we could have more of a community. If you go down to the end of that south wing of the Ross building, you'll see a pretty nice lounge. And again, that lounge was always there, but it was really dreary. And it was refurnished and it was laid out. You will see when you get off the elevators, turn immediately to the right, and there's a nice big room with a lot of windows, our meeting room, that's so nice that, in fact, the university often commandeers it for its own meetings, named for Douglas Verney, one of our distinguished retired colleagues. That was shaped out of nothing. I mean, the thing had to be, in fact, what happened was Leo, I had to check on this to be sure, Leo's next door neighbors are architects, and he, with, again, force of personality, dragooned them into coming up at York, looking around and coming up with some interesting ideas, which he then was able to get converted into these changes. The graduate student area, named for Ann Stretch, our beloved former graduate student admin, also was put together in a way that, believe me, what existed for the grad students before didn't have anything like that shape. And in other words, the whole entire physical layout is a testimony materially to a vision that wanted to have more public space, more engagement, and more involvement. And you see that. And then, by the way, now when you go up and down all the floors of the Ross building, everybody else saying, gee, this is such a good idea, we're going to do that too. You can, again, like the Borgesian story, you can find little corners where you can still see the dreary traces of what used to be. But mostly people looked and they said, hey, if political science got that, we want to get it too. So that's the physical manifestation. In terms of the behavioral, institutional manifestation on a bigger level, I really need to consult my list. There are that many different things that happen. But for example, these things I alluded to, the traces of which still exist in room S666, the departmental seminars. We only used to get together in a time that everyone put aside, Mondays at 2:30 in the afternoon, for departmental business. Leo decided, wouldn't it be a great idea if we had, first of all, we'll institute a committee, an academic initiatives committee, because Leo's also a pretty good delegator. You know, he doesn't want to take on all this stuff himself, but it's also a reflection of his, as Stephanie has emphasized, you know, there really is a kind of democratic impulse there where he wants to let more people have a say, because you come up with better ideas if you have more people talking about it. So we suddenly had all kinds of departmental seminar set up, and again, not just bringing talent in from the outside, but where colleagues, unheard of previously, except for very early 1970s, colleagues actually got together to talk about the work they were doing. Astonishingly, for the entire department to take part in that, where graduate students were invited as well to talk about their research and their work. So again, I think you can say, I could elaborate on this, I could just go on and on. I hope you're getting the idea that there's a broader vision behind it all, and it's always opening, and it's always bringing in, and it's always participating and shaping, but letting people themselves shape it. Also, John mentioned the lecture, the annual, it was an annual lecture in political science, but it didn't exist before Leo. Leo is the one who insisted that we should put that thing together, and not only should we have the usual suspects, i.e. faculty and graduate students, but let's open it to the broader community, to our undergraduates and their families, and bring them in and show our colors, and have stuff going on out there that would show people, gee, what is it that your kid does when he or she comes to university and studies political science? So we would have, yes, very distinguished speakers. I think the very first one we ever had was Sheldon Walden, and running through a gamut of all kinds of different perspectives and different points of view, and that's another thing. And then finally, I guess it's one other thing just in terms of opening. We had occasionally had end-of-year parties. And again, this is partly a function of Leo and Melanie's generosity, and also a function of the size of their house, that they were able to open these end-of-year parties, again, not just to include faculty, but graduate students as well. Or at least graduates. I'm not quite clear on this. I think it was the entire graduate student community was invited. It might have only been TAs, but then that would have been all the PhD students anyway. So once more, you see exactly the same thing going on. I'd love to conclude on a note of canonization, like a canonization tribunal. But if you know anything about canonization tribunals, you know that there's always a devil's advocate. Right? And that, by the way, that is really where the concept of devil's advocate comes from. That when someone wants to present someone to become a saint, the church appoints someone to advocate on the side of the devil to point out all the horrible, terrible things. It's not horrible, terrible things that Leo did. It's the horrible, terrible things that happened after Leo ended his tenure as chair. What happens is, what it proves is you can change the institutions, talking about one of the themes we've been talking about here. You can mobilize, but if you don't sustain it, if you don't continue the struggle, if you don't keep the activity going, it, like other movements of much greater moment, to be sure, it drifts off into sort of nothing. I'm happy to report that there are some efforts being made to resuscitate a little bit of the activities that take place in the department. But I mean, we used to have retreats that we went away for a couple of days. We played ball together, we shot pool, we went to jazz music and dance, in the evenings. And everybody got together and didn't just talk about what the current curricular needs of the department were, as our current so-called retreats are, where usually we just end up hearing dropped from on high what the administration expects from us for the next year. But we actually explored and churned our way through something, sometimes with more success, sometimes with less success. But that's democracy, right? That's what happens. So there it is, folks. You wanted a legacy? You've got a legacy.